Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome to This Week in Mormons. Very excited to bring you the show this week because we've got some interview action happening. We've actually had a bit of a lull kind of going through the fall and getting through the holidays. We've been straight news for a while, and I'm really excited to get into that. Before we do, though, just want to remind all of you to visit us at thisweekinmormons.com, where you can find any notes for this show or any of our regular newscasts, as well as for all our blog content and all that good stuff. What I'm basically asking you to do is show up and boost my Google AdSense score, so that the minimal ads we have on there can pay out better. You know, we don't do a lot of ads on here. And keeping that in mind, if you want to be part of the family, go to patreon.com/thisweekinmormons and pony up like $3 or $4 a month. And that helps us keep this whole production going largely free of other intrusions, which is kind of nice, you know, so, and we get a sense of community. I love all of the dozens of you who are in there helping us out in that regard. So please do that and join us on social media and all the usual places, Facebook, Instagram, sometimes Twitter. But personally right now, I'm a little cold on Twitter, but we won't get into that on this show. That's not the purpose of what we're doing this week. Ask me offline if you want to hear about that. Anyway, everybody, I've got a fever, and the only solution is Lefevor. Tyler Lefevor, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff. Happy to be here.
Is back with us this week. So if you remember, and we're also joined by Sam Skidmore. How's Sam? How you doing?
I'm doing great.
So I'll introduce Sam and Tyler, and they can introduce themselves. So about 18 months ago or so, Tyler was on the show with us, and he spoke about his 4 options survey. But he can tell us more about his background in a second. But he's a PhD and assistant professor of psychology at Utah State University, raised as a queer man in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and his research focuses on building bridges between the LGBTQ plus and Latter-day Saint communities. And I believe Tyler still lives in Utah last time we checked in, unless you've moved.
Yes, he does.
Back
He lives
in Tennessee.
Yep, lives in Utah.
Where he operates a small private therapy practice. So Tyler's here. He's got some new research and findings to share with us. We're going to talk about some issues pertaining to LGBTQ Latter-day Saints and leadership. And likewise, we're joined by Sam Skidmore, who's a graduate research assistant and at Utah State University. Would that be correct, Sam?
Yep, working with Dr. Lefevor.
Dr. Lefevor, a third-year doctoral student, which is super, super awesome. And Sam's research and clinical focuses include understanding the experience of religious LGBTQ plus people and ways in which LGBTQ plus mental health can be improved, which we know is a significant issue both inside and outside the church. We know it's a significant issue somewhere like Utah, where a lot of the fissures and the social norms and things like that can sort of come to a fore in a much more dramatic way, per se. You know, anywhere I think where you have like basically a large majority rule, where it's a little more, where you lack more heterogeneity culturally. And that's not to say Utah exactly has that, but because you have a dominant socio-religious element there, you know, that affects how things are culturally in the state, which is the norm. Like I served my mission in Spain, and obviously Catholicism played a big role in how things are there, right? So I'm excited to talk about all these things this week. If I missed anything, Tyler, Sam, any other way you want to introduce yourself for our listeners? Did we touch on everything there?
No, you got us, Jeff. I'm going to put a quick promo for our web where you can find us at the start.
Oh, sure. Plug it.
Our website is www.4optionssurvey.com, number 4 options with an S, survey.com, or lgbtqmormonresearch.com. Both of those sites have links to other work that we're doing and the collection of work that we've already done.
Do you worry that by not making the domain LGBTQ Latter-day Saint research.com, you are alienating the you know, like
half of our participants?
Yeah, I say it in jest. I do wonder, like, people ask me that a lot, given the name of our show. I'm curious from your perspective if you think there's any.
Yeah, it was a big crisis when I was figuring it out, and I wanted to LGBTQ Latter-day Saint Mormons.com, but that was way too long.
That is the URL from hell. That's terrible.
The truth though is, I've kind of landed on Mormon as a cultural group. And so if I ever have to pick one of them and I'm not speaking to a specific audience, I tend toward Mormon. If I'm speaking about active members of the church, I go Latter-day Saints.
And that's kind of been our play as well, even though I would say like 95% of what we do on here focuses kind of on like the Brighamite part of church history, right? And so we can say it's like This Week in Mormons because every now and then we talk about James Strang or somebody else. And it's like, yeah, it's a big tent. But that works. So for those who were listening about 18 months ago, it was like fall of 2020. It was during COVID where everything's been a blur. I know that. Tyler came on to talk about the 4 options survey that he'd done. Tyler, can you just refresh us on what that was all about, what we discussed last time you were on?
Yeah, so we are really interested in following LGBTQ plus and same-sex attracted Latter-day Saints over the next 10 years to see how they navigate their sexuality, gender, and faith. So we collected data a couple years ago, had a bunch of people participate. Thank you for all of you listeners who did. And we just opened the second wave this month, actually. So we're looking for more folks, especially more folks who are active members of the church right now. And we're following up with the people who participated 2 years ago. So looking to do this for 8 more years, see how people's ways of navigating things changes and see how that impacts their mental health and their religious and spiritual health.
Yeah. And so you started with it 2 years ago and you said you got a new group. So is that group starting like the 10-year period now? So
it'll be kind of a staggered.
We go in a staggering. Okay.
Yeah, we'll have some preliminary data and write-ups in the next few months from the group that we started with 2 years ago. We'll be able to do some analyses to see what's changed. So maybe in a year I'll have new things to share. But right now we're collecting again. We don't know what's going to come.
And this was an interesting survey. And obviously we're not going to go into a ton of detail about that one today. You can listen to the old podcast. We'll link to it if you want to get into that, folks. But can you just remind us like what the 4 options were, what we're speaking of when we say there were 4 options for LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints and what does that mean? What are the options?
So 4 common ways of navigating sexuality or sexual orientation and faith. The first was being single and celibate.
No.
And the second is being in a mixed orientation relationship. So I am predominantly same-sex attracted, but I'm with someone of another sex. And those are the 2 options that tend to align most closely with the church, though the church officially doesn't promote any of the 4 options. They just say, like, keep the law of chastity and go figure out the rest. Option 3 is being single but not celibate. So looking for relationships, typically same-sex, but could be more broad. And then the 4th is being in same-sex relationships.
Yeah, and the one thing that struck me that I thought was so fascinating when we spoke before was that the mixed orientation relationships are a thing that can work. And we've talked about it since. I don't need to go into detail. But that was interesting because at least for me, as a Latter-day Saint, as someone I feel like I try to be very open and inviting and understanding of a lot of people in different positions with inside and outside of our faith community. But that's one of those things where I think it's been so easy for anyone to zero in and be like, yeah, buddy, like that's not going to work. Like, come on. But it actually does for people. And that's something great that humbled me a lot. And I think helps us understand that the church isn't necessarily saying do that. There might've been a time when maybe they would have implied that a bit more strongly, but that it works for some people and there's different walks. And like you've said, some of the options for people would be to not be as directly involved in the church for their own well-being. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. I know that you've since left the church in the past few years, but I don't think you're not advocating that people leave the church. You are
absolutely advocating to find the path that's right for them. And for some people, mixed orientation relationship is right, especially if they experience some degree of other sex attraction. And circling on what you said, Jeff, I think the important lesson for folks in the church is the openness and the acceptance kind of regardless of path. And so because people in mixed orientation relationships can feel a lot of stigma from people in their wards and stakes.
From jerks like me who were scoffing at the idea. It's true. Yeah, right. Yeah. And so what took us to this new survey? Is this new survey an outgrowth of the 4 options survey, or is this some new work that is within your sphere and it's just a whole new project? Tell us about what we're doing.
Yeah, no, it's a little different. I'm actually going to punt to Sam because Sam's been kind of the front line for a lot of this new research.
Yeah, so we actually took quite a bit of a different approach with this study. The 4 options survey is there's a lot of different measures, so people just fill out, I strongly agree with this, I disagree with this. But for this other study that we did, we found 25 LGBTQ current and former members of the church, and we sat down in 30-minute to hour-long interviews with each of them and really just talked to them and tried to get an understanding of what's going on here. Like, what are your experiences with church leaders? What's working? What's not? So I feel like this study felt quite different from others that I've been involved with in that it's we're here with the people, like we're listening to the stories and getting details from individuals.
Yeah, and we're hoping we'll expand it eventually and poll a larger number of people. That's going to be part of this next wave of the 4 options survey. We'll have questions based on what we present. but we really just wanted to understand what it is that people are experiencing. We didn't want to put words in people's mouths. We wanted to hear it from them.
How did you find the 25 individuals in question?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think most of them, if not all, actually came from the 4 options survey.
Okay.
Where at the end of wave 1, there was an option of if you're interested in being involved in future research efforts, just leave an email. And we actually got kind of an overwhelming number of responses of people who were willing to sit down and talk to us, which was very flattering. And so, given that number, we had the opportunity to really, I guess, choose individuals who represent diverse perspectives so that we could get a better understanding of a lot of different stories.
Yeah, we picked about half that were active in the church and about half that weren't, because we wanted the perspective both of people who were still talking with leaders as well as people who had left.
Mm-hmm.
And then thought a lot about things like sexual orientation and gender identity and race and ethnicity, and wanted to have people from different backgrounds, because it's probably different to come out as a queer Black man than it would be as a white trans woman.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And so in conducting these interviews, I mean, was there a standardized template? Was this more of a discussion and you just kind of took note of what went down? Like I'm thinking a lot right now. I'm thinking of parallels. I'm sure you've seen what Liz Brown McDonald was doing over the past few years. We interviewed her, interviewing similar individuals, but about parents' religious rigidity. You're focusing on church leadership, but I see some parallels too there to what she was doing in that same idea of getting a certain group of people, asking them about their experiences and trying to find the commonalities, maybe quantify that which is quantifiable, that sort of thing. Well,
yeah, we came up with, I think maybe it was 10 questions on the interview sheet. We've summarized it into 6 questions that we'll probably end up talking about in our discussion today. We kind of said, why is it that you talked with a church leader? What made you talk about gender and sexuality? We asked, what counsel were you given? What did you find helpful? What was unhelpful? How did it impact you? And then what were your reactions to talking to church leaders? So we were kind of just interested in zoning or honing in on each of these 6 areas.
Yeah. Well, let's get into those in a second. I mean, what made you want to focus in on the relationship with church leadership? Whose idea was that? Where did this main research question come from?
Yeah, that was me. I was working with an agency called the Louisville Institute that funds a lot of research on religion, and they're really dedicated to increasing the vitality of the church in North America. I was kind of looking over their mission statement and thinking about my experience as an LGBTQ Latter-day Saint. And I thought about interactions I had with church leaders and how the ones I had good, bad, and ugly. And thought one of the things that's closest, nearest, and dearest to my heart is wanting to work within a faithful LDS framework to create change for LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. I think working with church leaders is a really clear entry point to how we can make some change for folks.
Yeah. And what about you, Sam? What have your experiences been? Similar?
Yeah, I've had like wildly different experiences with church leaders throughout my own life. And I kind of got that sense from the people that we interviewed as well. But so coming into the project, it was really important to me actually to be able to understand these diverse experiences, because some people have great experiences and it's really helpful. And then some have really bad experiences and it's really damaging. And I think it's cool to be able to elucidate, I guess, what's going on both ends.
Yeah. Well, so you're kind of both hinting at the oft called bishop's roulette, right?
Yeah.
And whether it's LGBTQ plus issues or a litany of issues for church members, there's a lot that can happen based on what kind of leader you have that has absolutely nothing to do on what the handbook says or what's said in general conference, because we are humans and we channel our spirituality through the person that we are. And I think that that's okay. That's part of the mortal experiment. But what, I don't know, in talking to these people, do you have any insights in like what we can do to move past bishop roulette? Do you feel like bishop roulette is enough of an issue in this vein that it can make it so challenging for people that it's obviously like unfair? Like what can we do to somehow, I don't know, like codify positive change or do something to make some of these experiences at least a little more uniform and predictable while still maintaining, kind of the local, unique, individual nature of
Absolutely.
churchiness?
That's really the end goal of our research. Is we've created a 1-page flyer that we're we're sharing and we're wanting to actually do presentations for ward and state councils about what we found to kind of help make things more uniform. So we have a few concrete takeaways that we're hoping can at least make it so bishops and stake presidents can be more on the same page. But one of them is that there are a lot of different reasons why people talked with church leaders.
Mm-hmm.
We found that some people wanted like comfort or like emotional comfort. Some people wanted spiritual guidance. Some people wanted to repent. They felt like they had sinned. Others just wanted to be open about what was going on. They didn't want anything. They just wanted to share. And then others were just coming for part of like baptismal interviews or temple recommend interviews. And so one of the first takeaways that we found for church leaders is that it's so important to understand why someone's coming to you for counsel and give them the counsel according to the reason that they're sharing about their sexuality or gender.
So you seem to be implying, like, is there often a disconnect there with people approaching for one reason, but then bishops just kind of operating from, I don't know, like whatever toolkit they think they should be operating from? Like, do you feel like they're not lining up and hearing each other? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
I think I got the sense in talking to these individuals that a lot of the times church leaders maybe just don't know what to do in the situation. And in that context, they just kind of fall back on, oh, this is what the handbook says. Or like, hey, you know what you should do is you should keep the commandments and you should pray. And so like, I don't know. I guess what Tyler is saying is that if someone coming in because they want to be more open and want to come out will look quite different from someone who's coming in seeking to repent. And those people would likely respond quite differently to, you should just keep the commandments and you should keep reading your scriptures.
And if you're a bishop and you forget what to do, the answer is to be a human and not rely back on the handbook.
Yes.
That we found that empathy and like listening goes a much longer way than reiterating the church's doctrines and stances on the subject.
Yeah.
Because folks already know the stances, but what they want is to be seen and heard.
Well, and this is interesting because I'm thinking a little bit of our friend, Richard Ostler, whose whole brand is listen, learn, love. And we've had him on the show before to talk about that. And what's so fascinating to me is you will see him get review bombed for his books, for example, where people saying his approach is not aligned with what church leaders would say, which I'm like, oh, okay. Because he says, listen to people, empathize with them, understand them, and be their friend first, be someone they can talk to. And you're obviously suggesting the same thing based on your research and what you've seen. But the question I want to put to you is, it's one, people think whatever they want to think about Brother Ostler. And people might hear this from you two and also think like, well, yeah, but these guys, I hate to be crass, but like, but these guys have left the church, right? Like, what do they know? What do you say to that to try to mollify the concerns of the broader Latter-day Saint populace who might be like, yeah, but whatever, there are rules, there are handbooks, and you're just kind of basically preaching to sort of look the other way and not care about another term that I hate, but like, the gay agenda or something like that. And I know you've heard that. I think it's a horrible term, but like, what do we say to people like that to get them to be a little more open-minded and
stop hardening your hearts and open your eyes? No, I that's a really good question, Jeff. And it's something that ultimately I think we have very little to say toward the people who will listen to the things that we have to say need to be open to it. And Sam and I, in the work that we do, try really hard to build trust with communities. So if you look at our history of work, you'll see that we really engage deeply with faithful communities and try and produce work that is fair to everyone involved. So we aren't looking to grind any axes and trying to pull people away from the church. But I think ultimately it's a matter of trust. And we hope that we build enough trust with people over time that they can see that we are trying to help.
Did you find any particular distinctions in the results between those you interviewed who identify as LGBTQ plus, who have left the church, and those who are still trying to maintain their allegiance to the church, as far as either the reasons they want to talk to the bishop or their experiences with their bishop? Did you see any clear-cut distinctions between the experiences the different groups had, or was it across the board and just wild?
Yeah, I think a lot of our big findings actually were across the board, and that's what makes them so interesting. I think it's specific, kind of the counsel that people were given, and then that related to what the LGBTQ plus individuals found to be helpful was fairly consistent between people who were inactive, less active, and fully active, in that, like, it seems like church leaders are saying similar things. And it seems like regardless of what is being said, the LGBTQ plus people are really just saying it's so helpful. Like, it's the most helpful when I'm just listened to and I'm validated. Like, yes, I hear you. Tell me more about what's going on. Like, let me be here with you.
Yeah, and Jeff, Sam's right. With only 25 folks, it was really hard to distinguish. And if you ask us that question in a year, we'll have some really clear answers. Because once we have a couple hundred folks, we can do really quick comparisons on these kinds of things to see if there were differences. But mostly it really seemed like people spoke with one mind. And one of the biggest things that they said that we keep referencing is just listen empathically and be open, which I think there is a really easy way to do that as a faithful Latter-day Saint that believes in commandments and the gospel. I think it involves stepping into a really human space of saying, this is someone who's struggling. I covenanted to mourn with those who mourn and comfort those who need comfort. And what I'm doing right now is fulfilling that part of my baptismal covenant. I'm going to leave the judgment to the Lord for a few minutes, and I'm going to mourn and comfort. And then when we finish, if there's a need, I can remind and invite to repent and encourage people to be better.
What do we say to church leaders who might be, I don't know, like, I don't envy a lot of bishops for being in some of the positions they're in. Like, you just, you said some of them, they don't know what to do, so they default to the handbook. Okay, and then that alone, right there, like, I don't envy bishops because they get faced with situations where they don't always know exactly how they should react. And I imagine, especially because these are individuals who are set apart in a certain capacity.
Right.
They are both spiritual leaders. They are judges in Israel. We if you believe they're in these very important roles. And they also have a job, as they're often told, to defend the church, to defend the doctrine, to do things like that. What do we say to leaders then to help them also sort of, I don't want to say like they should have to feel like they have to walk a certain line to kind of balance everything, because I don't know if that's necessary. But at the same time, I think you are balancing the demands of perhaps leaders above them, people who are saying this and that to them, and even what might be their own innate desire to be welcoming and hospitable, but they might feel the pull of something else to try to like protect the church. I hope that makes sense. Like,
totally.
There's a lot of expectations to balance there. Like, what do you tell the leaders then? What do they do?
I've got two different ideas, and Sam's probably got even more, because we found two really contrasting findings in our interviews. One is that these interactions deeply matter for folks, that the impacts of interactions with leaders lead people to disengage from the church, they lead people to nuance their faith, and they lead some people to engage more fully with the church. So on some level, it's actually a super high stakes situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ironically, we also heard a lot of people say, I know that my leaders are human and that they're doing the best that they can, and I am going to honor that. And so we heard a lot of grace and forgiveness from LGBTQ plus folks. So I think for leaders, holding that it's an important conversation, but not getting swept away in the like overall implications is helpful. I'm going to layer on top one more layer that we know that most LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints will leave the church. And I think it could be really helpful for leaders to step back, to give themselves a little bit less responsibility for governing someone's life, and to allow people the agency to make their own decisions, and to think of themselves as like on the road to Emmaus, as a walker with, rather than someone who's always needing to guide.
That was really nice.
Can you speak to that for a second? You said, we know most LGBTQ Latter-day Saints will leave the church. I don't necessarily doubt that assertion, but I would be curious to know what is the research? What points you to saying that?
Yeah, I did talk a little beyond the data there, Jeff. So thanks for the call out.
And you call yourself a doctor of philosophy, no less. But
that is, so we haven't done any longitudinal studies. Which is why the 4-option study is so important, so that we can actually track and quantify numbers and percentages. But we do know from like national data that it is about 2/3 of LGBTQ folks who are not religiously affiliated, compared to 1/3, who are not, compared to 1/3 of heterosexual and cisgender folks who are not religiously affiliated.
Okay.
So it's almost double the rate.
Yeah.
And so if we kind of just project that on Latter-day Saints, then it's probably about 2/3 of Latter-day Saints, people who are born Latter-day Saints, that ultimately leave the church. And I guess I think that it's really helpful to understand that many people, one of the common routes is to leave the church, and that creating more resistance and barriers can actually make their life much worse as they're leaving, and probably wouldn't make the people stay who are going to stay.
Well, I guess you could almost sum it up. It's very easy to kind of preach the fear angle. I think people like, if you leave the church, this is what you are leaving. You will lose everything. And it's funny because it's actually just tonight there was something going around social media of a prominent, beloved church figure who was saying this at a fireside over the weekend. And we can talk offline if you want. Go to our Twitter feed and you might see what I'm talking about. But that can be like it can be counterproductive.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and it's not to say, at least for active Latter-day Saints, that it doesn't mean you don't try to protect the institution and what you believe to be doctrinally correct. But at the same time, you're not going to like browbeat people into exaltation by just telling, right? Just just telling them like, if you leave, you will be damned. This is bad, 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 bad. Stay where you are. Like, is that the path for everyone?
I think. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sam.
No, Sam, you go ahead.
Thank you. I will. Like one specific story comes to mind from one of the interviews that just stood out wildly to me because I'd never heard anything like it before. But one individual had gone in to speak to their bishop and come out, and essentially they were saying, I think I'm going to be distancing myself from the church. So they were already kind of in that process. And it was just so interesting that the bishop, when the person told me, I remember thinking like, this is going to be a bad story. But they were like, no. And the bishop got up and gave me a hug and said, obviously we'd love it if you stayed, but you get to make your own choices. And I want you to know I'm going to support you regardless of whatever you choose. And I'm always going to be here if you want to talk about coming back to the church or need support in your next steps. And it was just like such a beautiful example of like compassion and love and highlighting agency of like, at the end of the day, you get to choose your own journey, and we'd love the church to be involved, but if it's not, I'm still going to be here for you as a human.
Sam, if I can piggyback on that, that was my experience leaving the church at the end of the day. That when I had several interactions with church leaders leading up to that weren't all as positive, but once I kind of understood where I was, I talked to my bishop and I told him that. And he was very much of like, Tyler, we're so glad that you've been with us, and it'll be sad not to have you, but we want the church to be a positive place for you. And if it's not going to be, I can respect that decision. And I had a member of the stake presidency call me in, and like in the process of having my name removed. And I was so scared to go talk to him. And he had the same energy. He's like, look, it's so important to me for you to know as you're leaving that we want to make a place for you. That if there is a time you want to come back, we want you to feel comfortable and free coming back. And it was really refreshing not to feel challenged in leaving, because that would have made my defenses go way up, but just to feel seen and heard and loved as I was doing something that must have been really hard for these priesthood leaders to watch me do.
Yeah, I can I can only imagine. And did you feel, at least Tyler, in your experience, when we talked about kind of the fear angle of it, and because having your records removed from the church, it's a big deal. It's a lot different from just being on like the do not contact list or something like that, right? Like, you're essentially you're renouncing covenants and things you have done and doing a lot. That's a very big step. And I know a lot of leaders, of course, will say, I get where you're coming from, but you understand like this is a big deal. This is not just saying, leave me out of it for now. This is literally saying you're throwing this aside. And that's, sorry, go ahead.
It's hard. Yeah. And I think that's what made it feel so positive for me at the end of the day, because if my bishop or stake president had really pushed me and questioned me, that would have implied that I hadn't thought through all of the things beforehand. And the truth is, I've been thinking about it for a decade. Like that has been all I had been thinking about. And leaving was ultimately what I felt like was the only way for me to move forward. It was the choice that I deeply didn't want to make and avoided making for that whole decade. And so when my church leaders responded by saying, like, we love you. It's going to be so sad for us to see you go. Are you sure this is what you want to do? We will respect your decisions. That was, I don't know, for me, that was a really beautiful parting message. And I think has allowed me to keep a positive relationship with the church after leaving.
This isn't exactly part of the research, but given all that both of you have done in your academic research, what do you find are the main factors for LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints that cause them to decide to leave? And leave could be either have records removed or just be out of it, even if the records remain. Is it more just the fact that we struggle to find whatever the correct balance and relationship is between the LGBTQ plus community and being Latter-day Saints? Is it truth claims by the church? Like, is there a dominant thread there that really causes people to finally say, yeah, I think I'm stepping back. I think I'm done.
I've got some thoughts, and I see Sam does too.
And I'm sure and I know you've had your own personal experiences too, and those are fine too, but I'd love to know whatever you have to share.
I can't believe I'm going to say this on air, but I think that ultimately the church's position leads a lot of LGBTQ folks that there isn't room in the church for LGBTQ folks because of the church's position. And people can say otherwise and try and make room, but doctrinally, there is very little room. And what I've seen, especially as a therapist, is that it hits people as they go through their development. So it's fine until you're 18 if you're a sexual minority and are starting to date after your mission. But people between 20 and 30 are like, well, I want to have sex. Or actually, not even that. They say, I want to have a relationship and someone that I love. And if you're trans, it happens earlier. And because they say, like, to live as in a gender and a body that doesn't belong to me is going to make me kill myself. And so I think there's this piece where there isn't space, and then people go through development, and that as they just hit these really typical developmental milestones that everyone hits of wanting to partner up and wanting to feel authentic in gender, they have to look at the facts and like, oh, this just really doesn't fit for me.
Yeah, I would just echo Tyler. I don't know from the research if there's like any one thing that has clearly been found as like, wow, when someone feels this specific thing, they're going to leave the church. I think there are quite a few things, but at least anecdotally for myself, it's kind of a mix of there are these church teachings and I'm grappling with them and I really want them to fit. But the more I try and make them fit, the worse I feel about myself, the less hope I have for my own future. And for a lot of people, I think it gets to this point of if I'm going to keep like espousing this belief, like I have to face the idea that I'm going to be alone forever or that I might like actually harm myself, which is yeah.
Oh, sorry, Sam.
Go ahead.
Which is why I think the people who it works for are the people in the middle of this continuum with sexuality and gender. People who say, like, there's enough of me that can be attracted to people of another sex that I could partner up. Mm-hmm. Or I may be trans, but I am, like, there are enough pieces of the sex assigned at birth in me that I can live okay with the gender that I'm told to live. And so there's just less, like, distress because of that. Because I think what Sam said that really resonated with me is that people want to stay. Like I'd say most or a lot of LGBTQ Latter-day Saints don't want to leave the church. And they find after years or months of wrestling that it can't or it doesn't work for them.
Kind of a square peg round hole thing at the end of the day. Yeah. Which means, what? So when people are meeting with leaders, I know one of the main things we talked about, you hinted at it a little bit, but like what counsel is frequently given by, if I can use passive voice, what counsel is frequently given by, sorry, I'm an editor and I'm bad, but what counsel do leaders often give to LGBTQ Latter-day Saints when they go to meet with them? And obviously they're coming from across the spectrum, but what's the most common counsel they seem to receive?
Yeah, by far the most common was focusing on the gospel. So what we might call church or primary answers of keep the commandments, like keep coming to church, read your scriptures. Sometimes there were blessings involved from the church leaders, which were typically positive experiences. And then behind that, there was more of like focusing on restricting same-sex sexuality or gender expression. So like,
what would that mean? Like to restrict it in that sense?
Yeah. So like, don't come to church as like the gender that you are. Essentially, like don't dress as a man.
Okay.
In terms of same-sex sexuality, restricting that, I guess, aside from keeping the law of chastity, would be perhaps like stay away from other LGBTQ people, maybe avoid queer spaces because that's not going to be helpful for you. Try not to consume too much LGBTQ media.
Is that, I just want to say, is that insulting for people in your shoes? Because it would almost assume the flip side of it. Like I, as a heterosexual male, am I imperiled by consuming heterosexual media and being around heterosexual people? Like, does that make me more likely to, and of course the issue with this is like, but if I express my heterosexuality, I'm totally like above board and cool as far as church stuff goes. But is that counsel that you receive being gay men? Like, it's not, it's like I don't know. It makes me think it's a class thing. Like people think that like, gay men are pedophiles, like that kind of a thing too, right? Like you can't be around places like this because you're going to be tempted to act a certain way. And I have to assume you're like, well, I'm an adult. Like, I mean, I'm not going to like, just because I'm around other gay people, like be more gay or less gay. And please forgive me if that sounds rude. I'm not trying.
I just want to scream, the more you hold it down, the bigger it comes up in other places.
Okay.
So the more you avoid LGBTQ spaces and people, the more you're going to masturbate, honestly, or the more that you're going to do like the bigger things that you're trying not to do. So it's a really terrible idea for most people.
Okay. And what are some of the other ones? I know we've got the list here. I'm following along. But because all those are very different things. There's focus on the gospel, which for some that I hope that's like a comforting thing. Be like, hey, you're okay. Like keep doing the good things you should be doing. Don't give up on that. Then it flips around to restrict yourself, right. Restrict who you are. What are some of the other common outcomes?
It's fascinating because the next comment after restrict same-sex sexuality and gender expression was accept yourself. Like, learn to practice being okay with who you are. Some people even went so far as to say, like, God made you this way. So, like, this is you. And then the next most frequent was, I guess, highlighting agency, like that experience I shared earlier of the church leader basically saying, I'm here to respect whatever choice you make. Like, use me as a sounding board if you'd like, but this is your choice.
And so from all of this, I mean, what things did those who have had their experiences, what did they find most helpful from their leaders at the end of the day? And what kind of counsel was like the least helpful as well?
Yeah, I can tackle this one because we've talked a lot about the most helpful pieces. So it's the empathic listening and openness. And the least helpful was a lack of empathic listening, which is not surprising. But there was a piece of the least helpful that was about a lack of knowledge or experience with LGBTQ individuals. And the way it came up was LGBTQ folks would say something like, my leader seemed to just really not get me, or like not get my worldview. Like they had a limited worldview and experience. And because of that, they had a hard time understanding the experiences and challenges of the folks in their offices. So it made for a really clear takeaway that as a leader, one of the best things that leaders can do is simply hear stories. So going to podcasts like this, or Gay Mormon Stories, or Voices of Hope, and listening to the stories of LGBTQ Latter-day Saints will help you get like a range of understandings of the different paths LGBTQ Latter-day Saints take.
Do you think ward leaders should be more like they can listen to that? Should they be more proactive, perhaps in engaging in programming, lessons, whatever you want to call it, like talking about these issues in church, or does doing that like uncomfortably single out those among our flock who are working through these issues and make them feel like they're a cause, if that makes sense?
I love the idea of that happening, of those trainings or meetings taking place, especially if they happen without the bishop then being like, we're doing this for this member who is gay.
Right. Oh, yeah. Let's get the whole ward together for Jerry.
Yeah.
The whole ward.
Because I think everybody can benefit, honestly, from kind of hearing these stories and expanding this worldview of making.
And everyone's thinking about it already.
Yeah.
And that's what I found. Like I've been in leadership meetings, or I've witnessed where like youth have been polled in a ward and said, like, basically said, like, we're coming into a new year. What are things you like to talk about? Like, we have our regular lessons, but what are issues you'd like to discuss? And a lot of youth brought up, not saying that even they were necessarily working through same-sex attraction, but saying, like, I want to, like, talk about this and understand it better. And I've seen this pretty strongly, like, from all this saying, like, I just want to kind of know how to navigate this space, how to talk to my friends who experience this, or what I should say about it.
Yeah.
And then I've seen youth leadership right afterwards say, like, no, we're not going to do that. Like, we're not going to focus on this, because they'll say something like, because we are all Latter-day Saints, like, to kind of paraphrase that talk Elder Bednar gave a couple of years ago. And I thought, to be clear, Elder Bednar's remarks were worthwhile. He was saying, just don't, like, restrict the label of yourself to, like, the couple of things that distinguish you from others. I got that, but a lot of people took it to mean, like, no, we're not supposed to focus on our differences, on these sorts of things. And this is just me, but I thought that seemed so damaging, because the youth clearly are aware of things that are going on. We don't give them enough credit. Youth, we think they're extremely innocent and don't know what's going on in the world, and they do, more so now than ever. I mean, from the time I was in high school, when it was frankly totally socially acceptable to use just the word gay as a pejorative and, like, just tease people and just, like, dude, that's gay. Oh man, like, it's terrible. That was totally normal in the 90s. That's not as normal nowadays. Not that we're still not dealing with hate crimes and things like that, but the kids see a lot of this. And so I don't know, I just, talking to both of you, I have to imagine, like, I wish ward leadership would just say it's safe for us to actually engage on this. We don't have to make the whole ward about this one thing all the time, but why would we not open this up and talk about it?
And Jeff, I would even posit that this is critical to keeping youth engaged with the church who are heterosexual and cisgender, that we live in an age of social media where they will know LGBTQ folks and they will have to answer, like, how is it, they'll have to have a solid answer for themselves of why is it wrong, even if I'm straight or cisgender, in a way that maybe yours or even my generation growing up didn't have to, because there was fewer stories around. So talking about it in church makes it something that can be talked about so people can find answers and stay in the church.
Well, how do you recommend, I mean, we talk about sort of the leaders' reactions. What should LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saints, are there things they can do to differently or to be even more effective with their leadership? Because, like I said, it's bishop's roulette. You might try to open up to a bishop, and it might say it doesn't go as you're hoping at one point in time. Fully acknowledging that sometimes we all meet with people and things don't go as we're hoping, because the Lord works in different ways and things don't always go as you're hoping. That's fine. But, like, if you're trying to build this relationship and maybe it doesn't really work the first time, are there approaches those on the inquiring side can embrace to perhaps be more effective and draw more out of these leaders as well?
Yeah. To be fair, we didn't focus on that in this study. So this is perhaps more anecdotal. One thing we did find in this study as a preface is that almost all of our participants had this essentially, they all had this thought that if I go in and talk to a church leader, it's going to go really, really poorly. And even people who shared, like, horrific experiences in the interview would then say, but I feel lucky. Like, I've heard so much worse. And so I think maybe even part of it is recognizing that there might be a bit of this story of talking to church leaders equals bad. And that might not be the most helpful way to approach a conversation with someone.
And what I would add on to that is that we saw in the data that leaders kind of reacted based on how participants came to them. So there's something developmental about being a sexual or gender minority, that people often start in a confused space and then kind of in a scared space, and then they accept and start to tolerate and then share their experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the more that an LGBTQ plus person can understand and figure out for themselves before telling a church leader, the better. Because then they're not going to come in this really scared place of saying, like, how do I do this? Which maybe church leader isn't the best person to talk to that. in that space. Like maybe mom or dad or friend is the best person. And instead can be like, hey, look, this is what's going on for me. This is where I am. I need your help to figure out how do I do this as a member of the church. And so it's like a little further along in development, which makes it less, I don't know, impactful, less volatile.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it's implying a level of trust with your leader as well, like saying, like, I am coming to you for this guidance. Like, help me. Like, and I think you're laying the groundwork saying, like, I'm not, yeah, like I want to be here. Help me be here. Like, what can we do?
Exactly.
As you continue your research, because you've interviewed those who have gone to leaders and then they've kind of reported on their experiences with it. Are you trying to reach out and actually find leaders, either present or past, and talk to them about their experiences on their side of it and what they've learned from everything?
Funny you should ask that, Jeff. We absolutely are. That's what we're starting to do right now. And our entree is that we're trying to reach leaders by sharing these messages with them.
Yeah.
But then after doing that, or separately, we're wanting to get leaders' like takes on this. We want to hear what leaders feel is most helpful or unhelpful, and hear the struggles that they're having. So we have a survey that you can link to in the show notes that for folks to sign up for or to put their names on if they're interested in having us present or in sharing their experiences as leaders with us.
Cool. That'd be huge. I'd be fascinated to learn about leaders, both those who have said, I've had these experiences and I want to share them, or some who might say, like, if they could be open about it, like, I'm deeply uncomfortable addressing these issues as a leader, which I have to imagine is a sizable portion of our church leadership, sure, especially in North America. And are you interviewing, like, is it international component? Is it pretty much restricted to, I mean, if you're doing interviews,
this is restricted to the United States.
Pretty United States, maybe Utah. Okay. I'm excited. I'm sure it's a whole different ballgame if you're interviewing members in like Belgium or something like that. Very different thing. Belgium and Europe, where we don't wear white shirts to church and no one cares. That's
the promised land.
That is I get, yeah. Oh, you know, Sam, you're Mancunian. You know how it is.
Thank you.
In the aisles, right? There's times I've gone back to Provost campus. I mean, I went to BYU for my undergrad, and like I've had a beard for a while now, and like I want to walk around campus and like hoping people will look at me like I'm an apostle and wonder what I'm doing there. And it never quite pans out that way. I really am like looking for the leers, and they don't show up. It's kind of it's unfortunate.
That's awesome.
Before we go, I just wanted to ask both of you, especially Tyler, since we last spoke. Obviously, there have been continued developments as it pertains to the church, to LGBTQ plus issues within the church and outside of it. I mean, there's a lot of things that have popped up, like BYU. Of course, there was the Light the Y, and now they've banned protests. And there was I don't know if you saw Arizona's compromise bill that just hit the news this week, which is they call it the church just backed it like today on the day of recording, and it's the idea to protect LGBTQ plus people in terms of housing and work discrimination, but still having allowances for religious bodies to have other things. You have David Archuleta being a lot more frank about things. Things are evolving, but I would just love your take, both as researchers and as former church members and as gay men. Like, how do you see things going so far in terms of the relationship between all these parties? How are we doing?
Yeah, I find that I have so much hope still. I don't know. Sometimes it's easy to look at the church as an institution or as an organization and to kind of be like, nothing's ever going to happen. But the more I'm actually talking to people in the church, the more hope I get, because people care, and people are learning more and more and having experiences with LGBTQ people. And I think there's so much power in that, and power of just like people showing that they love and support one another. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm quite excited to see what comes next.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sam. I think I'm pretty hopeful too. I'm encouraged that discussions about LGBTQ folks are happening in the context of the church now. That we used to have the website, right? What was it?
Gay and Mormon was the one.
Mormon. Yeah. And the idea that there are LGBTQ folks in the church is still relatively new. And I think that we are grappling better with that. There's a long, 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 long way to go. Right. And I don't know. I don't even know if a solution will emerge. I'm not sure that I feel confident that there actually is going to be a great solution. But I am so hopeful that there's conversation and dialogue, because I think that's all that we can do as humans at the end of the day, is be able to talk about where we're at and our differences and come to an understanding of each other, and that will get us to the best place we can.
Yeah. I'm going to hop in again real quick.
Yeah, hop in.
I have to shout out my thesis because it was all about church belongingness and how that's so protective against depression, suicidal ideation. And so I think a lot of my hope comes from, I don't expect there really to be this big, revelation or answer that makes church engaged work. But I'm really hopeful that the more people talk about this and the more that this, it becomes normal to talk about LGBTQ issues and to stand up for them within religious spheres, that LGBTQ people won't feel so isolated in religion, and some of those really harmful effects that can happen will start to decrease.
Do you feel like we can mitigate all the harmful effects and things we've talked about today? Is there any way to achieve that without the church actually having a doctrinal change that just opens up the doors for just, normal, completely sanctioned, homosexual relationships within the church up to and including the temple? Is that what it would? Can we get to any kind? I don't know what else. I don't want to call it detente. It's not like we're this isn't the Cold War, but you know what I mean? Can we get there, or where we stop having to worry about in these same issues about all these things and with the repercussions, the ramifications, without that? Because obviously, I think there are many who assume that will never cross that line. There's a lot who would assume that. So, do you think it can be done?
My gut reaction, honestly, is not fully. In that I think things for sure can get a lot better. And this is just speaking from my own experience, but I feel like being in the church, one of the really big, difficult things for me was, I can never be fully active in the church, go to the celestial kingdom and marry a man and have a family. And those are both they were both so important to me. And so if that's not possible, I can feel happy day to day. And I can feel oh, I belong in this church, and that's great. But I think there will always be a piece of oof, this feels weird. This is uncomfortable for me, this conflict.
Yeah, I agree. I'd say no, but I would follow it up by saying that I think we could get to a place within the church that same-sex sexuality or gender expression is treated like other things that the church disapproves of. There are plenty of people who have a lot of sex before they get married and smoke weed and gamble and do a lot of things that the church doesn't like that are still active members of the church. And I think that may be a more feasible model of what this may look like, that many LGBTQ folks ultimately may be active, less active members of the church, where it's still important they want to be there, even if they're not keeping all the commandments.
Okay, well, I appreciate those insights. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I've really enjoyed this a lot. Tyler and Sam, thank you very much for offering all of your expertise and sharing your research with us. We can, I think we can link to your little spread, your little one pager you shared with me. Is that fair? Or is that for public consumption at this stage? Okay. So we'll link to that over at thisweekinmormons.com. And once again, Tyler, you want to do, we've got the 4 options survey.
Yeah.
Just give us the URLs again.
Yeah. So www.4optionssurvey.com, and that's the number 4, and then options with an S and survey, and then LGBTQMormonResearch.com.
And is the latter the one that people should go to if they are leaders and they want to offer participate?
The latter is for leaders. The former is for the 10-year longitudinal survey.
Right. Great. Well, everybody, if you go to that, or if you know anybody, especially a leader who could be involved in this, I think this is a very valuable way to spend time if you're a leader in the church, offering your insights. So we can help others, and so we could all learn along the way. I'm not a bishop. I'm a lowly executive secretary, so I don't really count. I'm like quasi bishopric, right? But there's a lot we can do here. So I appreciate all you guys are doing and able to share this with all of us. So this has been Tyler Lefevor, who's the PhD over there at one of those schools in Utah State University, doing some great research, along with Sam Skidmore, who's doing he's a third-year doctoral student in clinical psychology at USU. Do they call it USU? Is that a thing people say? They just say Utah State. I don't know. I went to BYU. That's all we care about, right? Just the Cougars or die. I am the least patriotic BYU alum on the face of the earth.
No, I think I rival you.
I never even went. Did you ever? Can you say you never went to a football game? Because I can say that.
I went to one.
I can say that. I've also never been to a football game.
I never ever went to one. I think it speaks more to just like, I don't know, I'm socially off-putting and nobody invited me. It's probably something like that. Anyway, Tyler and Sam, thank you very much. It's been great to have you on the show. We wish you well. We hope to follow up with you. In a year, if you got more research, please come back and tell us what you learned from the leaders as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. And everybody, thanks for listening once more to This Week in Mormons. We hope this is worthwhile for you. Join us at our website, thisweekinmormons.com. Subscribe to this pod if you haven't done so. Leave it a review wherever you get podcasts, Apple Podcasts. Give it 5 stars on Spotify. Yes, you can listen to Spotify. I don't care about Joe Rogan. And all is well. So thanks for listening, everybody. Until we speak again, for Tyler and Sam, I'm Jeff, and we hope you have a good one. We'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.